Hello everybody and welcome back to a brand new video. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the GE tax that was proposed a few times now. I want to talk about what a GE tax would mean for old school RuneScape, whether you're just a normal player, into flipping or PVM, whatever. I want to have a look at how it would affect everyday players, and overall I want to give my opinion on a GE tax and whether I think it would benefit the game or affect it negatively. Anyway guys, hope you enjoy and let's get started. Now, to begin with here, why is a grand exchange tax even necessary? Well, a ton of gold comes into the game on a daily basis, and there is definitely more coming into the game than is being removed. Stuff like Vorkath, Revenants, Zulrah, and High Alkene cause a ton of GP to come to the game without much being removed. Now, one of the reasons that a lot of gold isn't actually being removed from the game is there aren't a lot of gold sinks in the game. A lot of people mention that there are no death mechanics, but that isn't really a gold sink, that is just removing items. So the tax would be removing gold from the game, however it would have nothing to do with removing items from the game. That is a completely separate issue. Equally as important, if not even more, but today we're talking about the tax. So there isn't actually much gold being removed from the game. Some examples of gold sinks that are in the game currently is of course the Alcarid Gate, which taxes you 10 GP, so not a lot. There are death reclaim fees for stuff like Vorkath and certain quests and stuff like that, where you have to pay 50k, 100k or whatnot to gain back your items, but it doesn't even come close to the amount of gold that is being generated. Now the problem with a lot of gold coming into the game is it will artificially inflate the price of items. However, in my opinion, it's not actually as big a deal as the amount of items coming into the game, as if we have a ton of twisted bows all of a sudden coming into the game, then the price of twisted bows will drop, making the content less desirable to do. However, if there's just a surplus of gold, then everything would generally rise up at a similar rate. In the end, not changing a lot, people will be able to make more money, but will also have to spend more money. Jagex has mentioned that they were thinking of adding a tax to the Grand Exchange, specifically 1%. Now 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is huge. To help visualize it, I've looked at some popular items and some of the highest volume traded items a day. Now this is for the last 6 months, as that was the most accurate data. For example, fire runes, there are 27.6 billion of them that were traded over the last 6 months, which would remove 1.38 bill from the game, a pretty significant amount. Zulrah scales on their own remove almost 30 billion from the game. Cannonballs are going to remove 15 billion. Chaos runes 8.2, death runes nearly 20 billion again, nature runes around 14 billion, blood runes 22 billion, so just within 10 of the most traded items is going to remove around 121 bill over the last 6 months, which is a huge amount. However, that doesn't even come close to something like the twisted bow. The twisted bow is traded around 550 times a day, and so that means over 6 months, that's 100k twisted bows traded, which would remove almost 1 trillion GP from the economy just from that singular item. Now, I don't think people would trade it if there was a 1% tax, but that is just an example. Another example is the Elysian, which trades around 200 a day, or 36k over the last 6 months, which would remove around 250 bill just from that item over 6 months. So a 1% tax is huge. I would argue too much so. But now let's move into how it would actually affect day-to-day trading and the economy. So first up here, I want to have a look at how a 1% tax would actually affect the item's price. And luckily, we have an item already in game that has a tax on it, and that is the old school RuneScape bond. Now, an in-game bond has a tax on it of 10%, which was implemented to prevent flipping of these bonds. There are some other factors at play, but I think this is a really good example of how this would affect the RuneScape economy on a grander scale. So currently a bond is worth 4.8 mil. That's too much, unfortunately. And the margin that is showing on GE Tracker is 487k, which is pretty much exactly 10%. So what exactly does that illustrate? Well, the margins for each individual item will grow to at least 1% to cover the new tax. Now, above and beyond that, the items will still have a regular margin, and in my opinion, the margins overall are probably going to be higher. Now, as I was mentioning, a 1% tax is fairly significant. I think a 1% tax would actually disincentivize people from trading items on the Grand Exchange, more specifically higher margin expensive items, but really any high value of any item. So a combination of the 1% tax naturally increasing the margin, I think less items overall would be traded on the Grand Exchange, which would then grow the margins further. With less items being traded on the Grand Exchange, the overall pricing becomes less accurate, the items' margins get more volatile, and really things just become less stable. Players really like the Grand Exchange because it's quick to sell your items, and is reasonably stable. You're not going to be losing a ton of money by instantly selling or buying things. Just to visualize things more, a 1% tax on a Twisted Bow trade would cost you 10 million GP. I don't think anyone would be prepared to buy and sell a Twisted Bow in a short time frame at least, because you lose 20 mil of it. So I think these hyper expensive items, including some of the rare ones like the Third Age Longsword, Twisted Bow, the Scythe of Vitor, I don't think these would ever get traded on the Grand Exchange, and they would be traded just person to person. So now how would this affect different players? Well, if you're a flipper, I don't think it would actually affect you too much. It would just increase the risk of flipping certain items, but I do think the margins would stay the same, if not grow. I think more specifically it would affect just day-to-day players who want to cycle through their gear very quickly. For players that are on a tighter budget, actually just like buying and selling gear frequently to do different content would become much less appealing, as you already lose like 1%-ish just by buying and selling it if you're impatient, and adding another 1% as a tax on top of that is just going to make it even less likely that they would do that. Now, we talked quite a bit about high margin items, but what about high volume items like fire runes, feathers, stuff like that? Well, I think it would be affected less. The volume for these items are extremely high. Even if 20 or 30% of people stopped trading these items, there would still be a ton of volume. So while the margins would get 1% higher, the volatility of the items wouldn't change. They're going to be extremely consistent, only have a couple GP margin maximum, and people generally aren't investing hundreds of millions into stuff like feathers or fire runes. So for each individual player, it wouldn't affect them as much. And generally, you're also not selling these items back on the Grand Exchange. So what are the pros and cons to a GE tax? Well, the main pro, of course, is having a massive gold sink in the game. I don't think we'd ever have to really worry about implementing them in other places. So that is a major plus. Now, another one I could think of is player-to-player trading is pretty iconic, nostalgic. A lot of people do want that. So having a big Varrock marketplace or a Falador marketplace would look very cool. So I would say that is a pro as well. However, there's definitely a few negatives that I can think of. Another pretty big one is the increase in scamming. I mean, scamming is still around, but with a GE tax, there would be an incentive to actually trade other players more frequently, where a lot of nefarious people will take advantage of that. Right now, there isn't actually a good reason to trade anyone ever, so it's really just dumb people falling for it right now. Where with a GE tax, there might be some slightly less dumb people falling for that. Something to consider. Now, one of the biggest negative things to a GE tax is less people using the Grand Exchange. A lot of people joined this game partially because of the Grand Exchange. If you look back at the player history count, you can see a huge spike from when the Grand Exchange as well as free-to-play was implemented into the game. So a lot of players are used to the Grand Exchange as is and like it the way it is, and specifically came back to play the game because of the convenience of the Grand Exchange. I think there is a chance that this could alienate certain players. If the Grand Exchange becomes less effective and less used, I think there is a real possibility that that could affect player counts and the overall happiness of certain players. And while I know a lot of players did enjoy the way it was back in RuneScape 2, where you had to shout out what you're selling, buying forever, I think actually having to do it again, most players would quit or be somewhat unhappy. So if Jagex was actually going to implement a tax, it would have to be less than 1%, I would say. 1% is huge, and while it would be a good gold sink, we're talking about trillions of GP that a 1% tax would be removing every year, which I think is pretty high to begin with here. Maybe start with a 0.1 or 0.2% tax, see if that is enough to affect things, and maybe ratchet it up a bit from there. Now, personally, I'm not exactly for or against the GE tax, but I would question the usefulness of a gold sink, and I think we should focus more on removing items from the game, either through implementing death mechanics again, or just adding in item sinks for items that have bottomed out at their alch price or stuff like that. I think that should be more of a priority because I think it has a more real effect on the economy short term and long term, and maybe hold off on the GE tax for now. While the death mechanics right now don't punish you at all, a really good suggestion that has popped around a lot is having a death reclaim fee, which would be a really excellent way to implement a gold sink and even maybe an item sink at the exact same time. If, for example, on death, you had to pay 1% of the GE value of your items to get it back, that would be a pretty decent gold sink out of the game, and it would be punishing for people making mistakes as opposed to just trying to trade day-to-day items. I think a lot of players would be more happy with that, as the loss in GP is directly due to a mistake, which I think will sit a lot better with players. Anyway guys, that is going to be it for today's video. Let me know what you think of a GE tax down below. Are you pro a GE tax or against it? Do you think the proposed 1% would be too much? Or do you have another solution overall? Let me know down below with a comment. Anyway guys, thanks once again for watching the video. If you did enjoy it, I would appreciate it if you left the video a like, and I will see you next time.